Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Oge Onubogu, and I'm the director of the Africa program here at the Wilson Center. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, braving this cold weather and being here in person. I'd like to welcome everyone here in the room and those of you who are joining us online. Before I go into the conversation, I want to introduce the president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green, to come up and give us some welcome remarks. He is no stranger to many of you in the room here today. Ambassador Green was a former USAID administrator. He also served as president of the International Republican Institute, was the executive director of the McCain Institute, and also former U.S. ambassador to Tanzania. He was also a former member of Congress. So, Ambassador, can I introduce you to the podium?
Thank you, Oge, and good afternoon to our guests and speakers, both here today in person and all around the world. And a special thanks to our friends at UNDP. They were great partners of mine in my days at USAID, and of course I'm delighted to be working with them here at the Wilson Center. So as many of you know, the Wilson Center is really unique in the foreign policy landscape. We're congressionally chartered, we are fiercely independent, and we are entirely scholarship-driven. That special status, I think, brings with it special obligations to not duplicate what others are doing, but instead to look for those openings where we can make the greatest difference and add value. And I think that brings us to the discussion today, one of the most important topics, I think, in the world today. So a decade ago, Africa Watchers were talking about democracy's historic progress in Africa. And it was reflected in some of the numbers that you saw from Freedom House, in the compacts that were being approved at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. In so many places, I think it was a hopeful time. These days, unfortunately, we're talking about historic threats to democracy and democratic governance. In the past 4 years alone, we've seen military coups in Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, Gabon, Guinea, and Sudan. We've seen the circumventing of presidential term limits in places like Cote d'Ivoire and efforts to do so in places like Senegal. So I guess the question for all of us is whether these are merely coincidences or, as many of us believe, many of us fear, something deeper and something perhaps more troubling. So I'm one of those who has long argued that this is Africa's time to lead. This is Africa's moment to shape the world. In so many ways, I think African leadership can make a real difference in responding to some of the challenges that don't just touch Africa, but touch nearly every corner of the globe. And yet I think we all worry that that opportunity for Africa to lead and shape the future, if we're not careful, it might just be slipping away. So what's changed? And as friends of Africa, how can we be helpful? Now, we're only going to scratch the surface today. This is just the start. But I think it is an opportunity to explore these questions further. And perhaps we can spur a constructive discussion and plant seeds for the months and years ahead. I can tell you, as the leader of the Wilson Center, we're in. We look forward to hosting those discussions, and we will do everything that we can to make sure that these key issues remain high on the agenda for policymakers in Capitol Hill, both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. So in the brief time we have, there's a lot of work to do and a lot of ground to cover. Oge, no pressure on you, but I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Can I invite our panelists up to the podium? And just a few housekeeping items. If you have your cell phones on, please put them on mute. So I'm really excited that today we have a wonderful panel to help us explore this topic. And as Ambassador Green has noted, today we will only scratch the surface of the conversation. There is a lot to cover, and I'm hoping that this conversation today will just be the beginning of a much longer discussion that will lead to forming recommendations and as we explore this moving further. So we have a dynamic panel today, and I'm going to go through brief introductions of our panelists. So Dr. Jide Okeke is the coordinator of the UNDP Regional Program for Africa. Before he began his work with UNDP, he spent time working with the African Union as the head of the Policy Development Unit in Addis. He was also a researcher with ISS and with CIPRI. He comes with extensive knowledge in security governance and preventing violent extremism in Africa. Ms. Khulud Kher is the founder and director of Confluence Advisory, a think and do tank, formerly based in Khartoum, Sudan. This organization works on 3 priority policy areas: peace and security, economy, and governance. And Dr. Joseph Siegel leads the Africa Center for Strategic Studies Research and Strategic Communications program with the aim of generating policy-relevant analysis addressing Africa's security challenges. I encourage you all to read their bios further. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Okeke. Could you give us a brief overview of the research findings and also just lay out your framing remarks as we go into the discussion?
Okay, and good afternoon to you all. I think in thinking about the resurgence of military coups on the African continent today, one thing is clear. You wouldn't find one single independent variable that you could manipulate, which would eventually lead to or convincingly lead to coups. There are a number of compounded factors or variables. But what we have seen, and this is why it was important for us to conduct the research, was that in the last 4 years, as Ambassador Green mentioned, we've seen 8 successful coups on the African continent. And that is significant. And so we wanted to hear from citizens themselves, so what is leading to this resurgence of coups? And I would really encourage you all to read the book, but let me just highlight 3 important findings from the report. I think the first finding, which is very reassuring, having interviewed 8,000 respondents, is that democracy is still very popular in Africa. The idea that you can choose your leader is one that citizens embrace quite positively, and it was very much reflected in our data. Out of those that we interviewed, 55% continue to prefer democracy. But in countries where we have seen military coups, 17% of those that we interviewed prefer non-democratic options. And that was what was troubling about our research. And we wanted to ask them, why? It is because of the democratic abuse by elite, by elected officials. It is because of persistent insecurity. It's because of corruption. So what we are seeing on the African continent is not a lack of popularity for democracy. It is a lack of popularity by citizens for democratic outcomes. I think that's the first profound finding of our research. The second is that when you look at the countries that have recently experienced coups on the African continent, and you just do a simple analysis of their total years of independence since the 1960s, at least 5 of them would have had over 300 years of independence, right? And out of that, over 200 years have been under military rule. Over 200 years out of 300 years, right? So you already begin to see a political culture in some of these countries that make military coups a likely alternative when democratic governance is facing deficits. The last point I would want to raise has to do with the correlation, what we call security paradox. If you look at the sub-regional context where we have seen coups on the African continent, what is very clear to us is that it has largely been in the Sahel, Western Central Africa. In fact, 6 out of the 8 coups that have happened in the last 4 years have been in Western Central Africa. But there's a security paradox here, in the sense that this is the region where we have also invested quite disproportionately in security interventions. This is the region where you have 5 out of 7 UN peacekeeping missions, right? With an average budget of at least $900 million a year. So maybe it's time for us to do things differently. Maybe it's time for us to proportionately invest in these hard security interventions, but also balance that with soft security interventions. And that is what our report also reveals. I'll stop there for now and happy to take questions. So please, I encourage every one of you to read the books. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jide. And on that note of trying to think about how we do things differently, I will turn to you, Khulud, to provide some framing remarks for the conversation.
Thank you, Oge. I guess the question for those of us who come from countries that are very prone to coups is, why do coups keep happening? And the answer is, well, why not? Because when they do happen, very little stands in their way. And these coups are often able to consolidate very, very quickly and change the legal framework such that they suddenly become legal. I mean, the regional economic bodies don't tend to be able to do very much. If you think of ECOWAS in the West and IGAD in the East, the African Union, for example, has been quite facile, for example, in being able to respond to the coups. And so there are very few barriers. There are very few costs, oftentimes, for these leaders who undertake coups. And oftentimes those who end up losing out are the citizens. So I'm not at all surprised by the findings that show that the large majority of people still believe in democracy and still believe that they should be in charge of changing their leaders, not some men in military fatigues. But there's that disconnect between the citizen and the state. And actually coups oftentimes entrench that difference, which is why oftentimes coups remain unpopular. Now, if we're thinking about how do we change the costs, how do we change the incentive structures or other disincentive structures that enable coups to, 1, take place, and 2, hold, then the obvious answer is, well, we can't just focus on those who undertake the coups. We have to focus on everybody else. And here you get into sort of murky waters because we have these sort of trite sound bites like invest in civil society. And the question then becomes, well, who is civil society? And oftentimes that's not very well passed out. Then you have questions like, okay, what kind of mechanisms, what kind of tools do we have in place? Oftentimes the tools we have to invest in, quote, civil society are from the 90s. They're from that post-Soviet era that, frankly, that makes them unfit for purpose. So we have to think of investing in new systems, in new mechanisms, in new tools that actually respond. And technically, there's never been a better time to do so because there's such a wealth of potential of engagement between citizen and state, brought about by technology, brought about by migration or movement within people within the country, which is quite dynamic within the region, thinking beyond just country-specific dynamics. If we look at the Sahel, and here I include Sudan as well, although for linguistic reasons it never is, which to me seems very colonial and completely misguided. But if we look at the Sahel and the way that climate plays a role, the way that migration plays a role, the way that all of these regional issues play a role, and then at the same time think about how we think of country-specific issues only when dealing with coups, obviously that needs to be something that we think much more broadly on. And just before I end, I think leadership is a big issue. And often we don't talk about that because when you're sitting in Washington, D.C., when you're sitting in Whitehall, when you're sitting in Brussels, your main counterpoint are those leaders. And you are sort of forced as policymakers to deal with them, but they are often, in fact, the problem. And the leadership vacuums that we have, the leadership challenges that we have by not properly investing in long-term engagement with future leaders really leads us to this dependency of engaging with the very people that often end up usurping all the best laid plans and all the investments in democracy and democratic outcomes. And that needs to change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Khulud. And moving on to Dr. Siegel, Joe, you do a lot of work and research on looking at presidential term limits, unconstitutional changes of government, but also engage in training African militaries too as well. So I'd love to hear your framing remarks as we set up this discussion.
Okay, thanks. Okay, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel. I would throw out a couple of points for consideration. First is that I think when we look at these coups that are happening on the continent, in the big picture, what we're seeing is a challenge by military actors to the notion that they shouldn't govern. There's a sense of entitlement on the part of Africa's militaries that they should be in power. And as Jide alluded to, in the countries that have had coups, in many of them, militaries have been in power some 50 out of the 60 years of independence. So this is a battle of governance norms. And these militaries haven't accepted the principle that there should be civilian democratic leadership. And when we break down the coups, we see, for example, in Chad and Sudan, these are countries where the military has never not been in power effectively since independence. In the West African Sahelian countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, you did have some democratic renewals happening after long periods of military rule. And so this was an attempt by the militaries to seize opportunities to regain control. In Gabon, it's a different case where you've had a civilian leader, but the military was very closely involved in maintaining the Bongo dynasty. And so they intervened to maintain their influence over time. So this is about military entitlement. I think it's important to keep that in mind because often when we look at the many challenges that these countries face, there's the sense, well, they were intervening for some reformist end. None of these coups are about reform. It's about power. It's about maintaining power. And in fact, tying it to the issue of term limit evasion, we've seen 14 African leaders evade term limits since 2015. 10 of those came to power through coups. And so there's this cyclical relationship that once you come to power through a coup, you usually don't leave through constitutional means. And so I think that's part of the bigger picture that we want to look at. Last point I would throw out is military leaders, military governments lack legitimacy. And so they end up looking for legitimacy outside. And in the case of the Sahel, Western Sahel, that has been through Russia. And Russia's the one that has been enabling and empowering these regimes through a torrent of disinformation, which helps to shape some of these narratives that we're talking about with regards to the failure of democracy. So it's not to say there aren't many challenges that these countries have had, but we want to be mindful of how some of these narratives are being promulgated in these countries. So let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you, Jide, and thank you, Khulud. All three of you have laid out some really important and key points in your framing remarks. As we think about this, the idea of preventing and responding to the resurgence of military coups and unconstitutional changes of government in Africa. As was mentioned, we'll only scratch the surface of the discussion today. But Khulud, I want to come back to you on a point that you made about this widening gap between citizens and government. Over here at the Wilson Center, we run a Sudan's working group where we're really trying to think about how we engage citizen voices in the discussions that are happening in DC and elsewhere on trying to resolve or address the crisis in Sudan. And this goes beyond just your regular everyday civil society organizations, but voices that may not necessarily be part of that organized civil society as we see it. We talk so much about engaging citizen voices, and from the work that you've done in Sudan and the work that you're currently doing in engaging voices, could you break it down to us in practical terms? What does this look like when we engage voices in the process, in the discussions around how we prevent these military coups or unconstitutional changes of government, and conversations around political transition as well?
Sure. I think Sudan serves as a really good case study because we had a revolution in 2018 and 2019 that unseated the dictator Omar al-Bashir, who'd been around for 30 years. And the people who led that revolution, mostly young people, mostly outside of what you might call elite circles, although of course certainly some within those circles, were basically completely ignored throughout the different phases of that change, whether it's iterative and incremental or the more transformative changes. And that really sort of laid the scene for how the international community failed the revolutionaries, if you want to call them that, the change agents in Sudan. And this is, of course, by no means unique to Sudan. But if we can really sort of draw a straight line between the way the international community engaged, for example, neighborhood resistance committees, who were the backbone of the revolution, and really how we got to where we are, bearing in mind Sudan has just finished its 10th month of a war, a civil war. And the reason for that is that you have, Joe said that, Russia supports these coup regimes, but the regimes that were there before, that were also quite unpopular in a lot of places, were supported by Western countries. And oftentimes, if you're someone sitting in some of these countries that have had a coup, you can't always tell the difference between what a US position is and what a Russian position is. One backs one set of people with guns, the other backs another set of people with guns. Where is the democratic dividend there? And if you can't tell the difference, as someone sitting within these countries, it makes it very difficult to engage with international actors when they frankly say one thing and do another entirely. And so when we think about the practical, reasons or the practical things we can look at, is that the international community often tends to withdraw when there's been a coup, and then only engage with what I consider focal points rather than genuine leadership. And when you stay and deliver, you might actually be able to get different outcomes. But withdrawing altogether effectively cedes the ground to the coup regime and those who back it, who of course are not after any democratic or civilian dividends. So that's an important part. The other thing is that you have to have a way of engaging with these countries before a coup takes place, and often the signs are very much there. And we don't have that. I mean, in the IGAD region where Sudan sits, for example, IGAD is meant to have an early warning system. The whole reason IGAD was created was to have an early warning system, for example, read drought, and later that developed into much more of a political early warning system. And that has completely failed. We need to invest in those institutions in the region that frankly have not been up to par for several years now at least, and find a way to engage not just them individually, but make sure that there's some kind of cooperation between them, between the UN, between the AU, between IGAD, because none of them can do it alone. And as these institutions and the West in general is withdrawing, we are seeing other actors, and it's not just Russia, the sort of everyone's favorite bad actor, but closer to the region, we have US allies that are undermining, quote unquote, US values and US policies in the region. And unless there is some way of working with these actors, you're always going to be in a position where, let's take Washington, D.C., is unable to grapple with the interests of its friends in the region and the democratic outcomes or otherwise that it wants in a specific country. And that conversation really hasn't even begun to be broached yet. So I think it was still quite early to have that conversation at the more global scale. But I go back to this issue of leadership. When we think of leadership, and I've been asked a question that I find very vexing in a country like Sudan, which is, where is your Mandela? And it's such a ludicrous question, because this revolution was not led by individuals, it was led by collective action. And it is precisely the collective action that has allowed these change agents to continue, even through a very brutal civil war, to mobilize politically and engage their neighborhoods and their communities. If you had, a Mandela, for example, where would he be? In prison or dead. So, again, thinking of getting away from this very 80s, 90s mindset about what civil society constitutes and what kind of help and support that civil society needs, and actually looking at structures that already exist that might be quite illegible to state organizations, including governments, including the UN and other state-based organizations, and breaking away with that. Effectively, we need to rip up the rule book. We need to look at doing things very, very differently. And as Jide will tell us, there are, mechanisms and institutions in the making that could potentially have the ability to incubate new leadership, the ability to look at really what could make a successful transition rather than just, frankly, winging it. and look at things in a much more regional perspective rather than just focusing on the individual countries' dynamics.
Thank you very much. Laid out some really important insights there. I want to remind members of the audience you can start getting your questions ready as I go back to Jide with a follow-on question, actually based on some of the things that Khulud has just mentioned. So when we look at our different continental bodies, the AU, ECOWAS, IGAD, SADC, all these organizations, institutions on the continent today are facing literally a crisis of legitimacy. And we still work through them. UNDP is doing some work through the AU, thinking through African transitions. I'm wondering if you could talk some more about that and how you're engaging with the AU and other regional bodies on the continent, given the reality that we're seeing in the way citizens view them today.
Thank you very much, Oge. Another very important question. I think before I answer that question, I just would want us to think about what the alternative of regionalism would be, or the alternative of multilateralism. It's fragmentation. That's a common denominator across board. And if we begin to think about, despite the political legitimacy crisis that some of these institutions continue to have, I think our role as the international community is to promote international cooperation in ways that will hopefully lead to efficacy of these regional institutions. And that is why, within the context of transitions and what we are facing on the African context, we've decided to engage with the African Union. And what we're doing with the African Union is quite unique because we are combining the political legitimacy of the African Union with the development comparative advantage of the UNDP. And that is why we created the Africa Facility to support inclusive transitions, right? Because what we found is that for you to prevent coups, you need a governance reset. And we've also seen from the data that there is a correlation, not a causation, between persistent underdevelopment in some of these crises, in some of these contexts where we've seen coups, and the risk of coups. So how do you reset governance, and how do you safeguard development? I think that's the theory of change that we're looking to achieve, and that is why we created the Africa Facility to support inclusive transitions. We're seeking to do three things. The first is that we would like to support transition mechanisms, institutions, and processes in countries. And we have done that in the case of Chad. We've just concluded an assessment in Mali and Burkina and Niger, where we are identifying creative entry points to support transitional mechanisms towards the restoration of constitutional order. I think that's the first thing. So there's a national level investment that is needed. The second is back to the point you made, Oge, around the crisis of these regional institutions. To what extent can we support regional economic communities as well as the African Union and promote increased lessons learned and best practices between them? And so what we're doing is to work with the African Union, with ECOWAS, to promote regional dialogues in ways that will promote a reset towards the constitutional order. Now, the last point is one that is anticipatory in nature. From our analysis, we recognized that there's a need for us to establish an Africa Political Risk Transition Index that would help us profile countries and identify countries that have inherent risk or overt risk when it comes to transitions. And on the basis of that, work with national actors, but also political entities at the regional level to anticipate risk and promote prevention. And that is why we are also working with a number of think tanks to establish this transition index. And we hope we can collaborate with a number of institutions here in the US as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jide. See, that important point you made about the need for a governance reset and to safeguard development. Joe, I want to come to you looking at this from where you sit over at ACSS. what can collective action look like? Jide has spoken about the work that UNDP is doing with the African Union and extension with the other regional economic bodies on the continent. Looking here in the US and also international, what could collective action look like? How can the US and other institutions work closely to ensure that the solutions that we're seeking to this, towards if it's preventing military coups, unconstitutional changes of government, or strengthening the process of political transition to ensure that these changes are sustainable and that action is collective. So what could a collective action look like?
Okay, thank you. Okay, for the question. So I think to start, when we talk about what role the U.S., and by the U.S., I think collectively we also mean international democratic actors, and what role would they play? I think the priority is to consistently support citizen agency on the continent. And as Khaldun mentioned, in Sudan, there is an existing civilian network. There are civilian leaders. There's a civilian collective of civil society organizations. There's the resistance committees. The United States, Western democratic actors need to be not only giving them a seat at the table, but making them the center of the table. It's their interest that matter. And I think it's the same dynamic we want to be looking at in the Western Sahel. There are citizen groups who are calling out for democracy in these places. There are journalists, there are independent civil society actors. Those are the voices that are getting silenced. And so with the coups, they've undercut all of these civil liberties and political rights that are the mechanisms of democratic self-correction. And so those are the sorts of things we want to be helping to focus on and rebuild. And so my vision of what this looks like is it's a multi-layered collective action network. You've got at the lowest level the citizens. They should be out there. That's the lead of any change. At the national level, you've got civil society groups, media, other good governance entities. Regionally, you have the regional economic communities. And then internationally, that is where international democratic actors can come in and help to support all of those initiatives. And it is through that collection of mechanisms that you get a legitimate core of actors domestically that can provide guidance to what the priority should be in these societies. And we don't inadvertently empower the very actors who are seeking their own interest at the expense of citizen agency. And this has value for governance. We know that it's important for development, and it's also important for security. RAND did a survey of counterinsurgency operations across the globe since the World War II, and one of the key factors for successful counterinsurgency is legitimacy of domestic actors that are seen as acting in the interest of their citizens. And I think that should be the focal point for U.S. engagement and to avoid lapsing into this easy accommodation of non-democratic actors.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Joe. So we have about 25 minutes, and I want to open it up to the audience for questions in the room and questions online. So if you could, sir. I think we have a microphone somewhere.
I can just speak loud.
Okay.
Dr. Mark Toller, fantastic conference. Really, really happy all of you could join us. A number of people have talked about this governance reset, and I'm fascinated about hearing more about what is going on and what could be done in Sudan. So thank you so much for being here. I'd like, if you could think about, is there a relationship that needs to be discussed about a governance reset and how that is or is not often directly related to an economic reset? Because if governance seems to be reset, but the economy, let's use Sudan as an example. With Ahmedi, he was in charge, he's still in charge of all the gold, all the artisanal mining. It's the primary source of revenue right now for that country. And yet, Bashir is gone. And the follow-on government is supposedly transitioned or in turmoil. But are we looking for a governance reset? I think we might be, this is a provocative question, might also need to have an economic reset, and Mr. Ahmedi controls all of that. Could you comment on that particular relationship, please?
Thank you. So we'll take another question along with that. Do we have any other question in the room? So why don't we, Khalid? Oh, so there are two more? Okay, there you go, sir. Microphone.
Yes, Darnley Howard from Advance International. I'm wondering if people can comment on what I've seen is that when I actually talk to occasionally people from some of the countries where there have been coups, there doesn't seem to be the level of popular outrage that you might think or that I might have seen in some cases. And it varies from country to country. But in a couple of cases, and talking to someone from Burkina or from Mali, you know, and ask them, well, what's it really like there? And to them, it's not that bad. And they don't seem to be as anxious to see the generals out of there as you might think. Whether it's because they're angry at the West or at France, or whether it's they're angry because they need someone to take care of the jihadist or whatever, or for whatever reason, they seem to feel that it was time for change, and if this is going to be changed, then okay, we'll roll with that. So, just ask if that's what you all are seeing as well in some cases.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll take one last question and then come to the audience, come to the panel for responses. The microphone is coming your way.
So I actually want to ask, what about the countries that actually are not holding elections, like Eritrea? So they haven't held elections since, like, I think 2001, and I don't think they're going to probably hold any, and Aziz is going to be probably, I don't know, forever leader. So what about those countries that actually don't even have a chance to hold elections? And Eritrea, as we know, is the only country, I think, that takes 2% from a resident of America to put in the Eritrea's economy, because that's like, I mean, how can we put sanctions? I mean, do you think sanctions can be a good perspective, like sanctions on putting on that 2% on what the Eritrea gets from us that there's no accountability of? What about the other countries? How can we put sanctions to help maybe these happen, you know?
Thank you very much. So 3 questions in summary. The first was on the relationship between the governance reset and the economy. Khalid, I will direct that question to you. The second question was on citizen reaction to coups. Judy, I think there are some findings in the research about this, so I will direct that to you. And then the question on Eritrea and elections. Joe, I will let you take a stab at that one, but others will be able to chime in. So Khalid?
Sure, thanks for the question. I think undoubtedly there needs to be an economic reset as well. The question is, how do you sequence that? And in some cases, bad actors like Hemeti won't be persuaded to give up both political and economic power. So there may need to be a trade-off. The key question there becomes, what does justice look like? Because unless you center justice in any of these conversations, what you're going to get is just new actors taking the place of others. So what we have right now is absolutely the legacy of Bashir, what some analysts call Bashirism without Bashir. But actually, one might, also say that we have, in some ways, worse actors who have learned how to avoid the pitfalls that Bashir fell foul of, and be able to entrench themselves even more. But throughout this past 40 years, at least in Sudan, in fact, since independence, but certainly in the last 40 years, the issue of impunity has never been properly addressed. And that is why you get, one, the secession of South Sudan in 2011, And two, the fact that Sudan has never been without war for the past 68 years of independence. There's always been one part of the country that has had, very brutal levels of violence, and there's never been a cost associated with that. In fact, if you pick up a gun, oftentimes you are rewarded with a peace agreement, with some kind of payroll piece. You get a nice cushy job. Your commanders get to live in nice villas in the capital or elsewhere in a friendly country. Being violent, having a gun, waging war pays off. And unless we change that calculus by centering justice, I don't think we're going to get very far with political and economic reform. And just the Mr. Howard's question about the fact that sometimes coups are popular, I think what people are responding to is the fact that they didn't like their regime and the regime changed. I don't think they think that somehow they will get all of their needs met necessarily through a military government, although there have been studies that show that in some countries, for example, like Uganda, people are to some degree supportive of the kind of military-led development because there's a consistency there. You're not seeing the chopping and changing every 4 years with an administration. But the question always comes, and this comes to the third question asked by the gentleman over there, which is what happens in places like Eritrea, and I would say in Uganda and Rwanda and Djibouti, where there's no succession plan because the transition's coming, whether you like it or not, whether it happens through a coup, whether it happens through a revolution, or because the incumbent passes away. And at some point, we need to think about, for example, through the AFSID, the different types of transitions that we can have. And more importantly, what are we transitioning to? And that question has never really been properly asked at any point of a transition, certainly not the one in Sudan.
Thanks, Salud. Jide?
Yes. So how do we explain this ephemeral popular support for coups? I think that's the question that you asked. And it is not in any way a receptiveness towards military coups. It's a receptiveness towards change. And if you look at the context as we've defined, and look at the regions where we have seen coups, you've seen persistent insecurity. You've seen persistent corruption. You've seen persistent level of underdevelopment. You've seen high level of unemployment, right? And a deterioration of livelihood opportunities. And so the idea of a coup, and when citizens tend to cheer around that, they are cheering with the anticipation and hope that things could get better. And this came out quite strongly in our report. They are not necessarily cheering for the military coup plotters. Now, what is very sinister to observe is the medium to long-term receptiveness by these same citizens towards the military regime. So the inability and the risk there's a potential risk there when there is the inability of this same military rulers to begin to provide the dividend that the citizens are looking for. It creates a risk, right? So we might not be able to tell with the recent coups because most of them are only 4 years old. But the litmus test lie in what happens in a few years. I think that's really important. And if you look at the idea of democratic promotion on the African continent over the last 20 years, I think what these coups represent to us is the need for an introspection because it appears that in the way in which we have promoted democracy over the last 20 years, we have promoted institutions, we have promoted processes, we've promoted elections, but what we have failed to promote is the renewal of the social contract between the state and the citizens. Would democracy really matter if democracy does not provide or does not lay the foundation for job creation in a continent that is, that is dominated by young people? I think those are questions that young people are asking. So there has to be that correlation, therefore, between democratic governance and the ability of that political system to provide services to citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Jide. Joe?
Okay, a lot to say. for, what about the countries that don't have elections or, are hardcore authoritarian? And I think we want to differentiate. So I think, the preferred approach is for the United States and other international democratic actors to say, listen, we have limited resources, and we're going to use those resources in places that are open to reform and are moving towards democracy. So you're incentivizing democracy. And in that way, the Eritreas of Africa are left out of that. And there then can be a juxtaposition for what their alternatives would look like, and then to double down, helping those democratizers to be more successful. That in itself creates a magnet for change. Now, there are the Eritreas, there's the Isaiases and others who have little incentive, little interest in really changing. And to the extent that they're abusive towards their populations, then yes, I think that sanctions are warranted. And ideally, this is done collectively with regional economic bodies and civil society groups. It isn't just coming from a single international actor. It's meant to send a signal that norms matter and that these things aren't just being imposed from the outside, but these are what citizens in Eritrea and other places want. And to be consistent about it. And I think that is a fair criticism of many in the West, is that it isn't always consistent. And in that way, try to uphold what are really African norms and African interest. And there are dividends from democracy. And I think that's important that we take out of this conversation. When you look at the Sahelian democratizers that were overthrown, all of them were realizing more per capita economic growth than they had in the decades before. Let's look at Niger as an example. Under Bassoum and Issoufou, there was a 26% growth in the GDP of that country in 10 years. The previous 35 years, the economy had contracted by about 29%. The projected economic growth for 2023 last year was 7%. Bazoum was investing in girls' education. There were a lot of differences. And so they had inherited these legacies of military authoritarian government. They were not, you can't expect there's going to be immediate change in any of these countries, which are among the most fragile in the world. But there was visible progress. A lot of problems still, and even governance and corruption problems. But there was tangible progress. So I don't think we want to lose sight of that as we talk about what needs to change and reforms moving forward. There's something to embrace in those democratic changes. A lot to improve, but it's a much better picture than what these countries had had, and now what they do have with these autocratic governments that basically are squeezing citizen voice and participation.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. We have a few questions online. Do we have any other questions in the room? So we have one question in the room. Is this a follow-on question to the one you had on Eritrea, or a different question? Okay, so I'm going to ask these two questions that we have online, and then I'll take yours as well. So one question here is, what economic and political indicators show that a coup may happen before it occurs, and what is currently being done by the US, the international community, and others in response to prevent it? And how would we like to see, and this person is also asking, how would we like to see that response improves? The next question is, what role does technology play in enhancing democratic processes and reducing the likelihood of coups in Africa? Then let's come to the question in the room. We'll take those three to round up.
Hi, my name is Kyle Toller. I am a student at the University of Lynchburg's Westover Honors College, majoring in political science. I also had the honor of actually traveling to South Sudan last summer, where I interned with the Ministry of Federal Affairs of South Sudan. And while I was interning with the ministry, I talked with a lot of the staff members, and they kept on saying, like, we want democracy, we're pro-democracy. And I said, they're having elections this year, actually, but were supposed to have elections last year and the year before that and the year before that. And so they told me that the problem is that the leadership of South Sudan, President Kiir, Dr. Machar, don't know how to let go of power. They just keep on staying and staying. And I think that's an attitude and mindset of a lot of African leaders, where they don't see the benefit in actually relinquishing power to let a peaceful transition of power, such as like George Washington here in the U.S. I mean, the reason he's remembered as being so great isn't because of him being president for 20 years. It's because he knew when to step down and let new leadership take over. And so my question is, how can the U.S. and other international actors change this mindset of African leaders to show that there is benefit in kind of stepping off and fading into the sunset and being able to then be remembered because of, that ability to relinquish power and let go and allow new leadership to take over and renew that social contract, as Mr. Akoke said, of renewing that social contract between the people and the leadership to promote that ethnic reconciliation and strong democracy and peaceful democratic transitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll take your question, sir. I ask that you please keep the question brief. We have 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure folks are able to respond as well as give closing remarks.
So would African Union be open to abolition of political parties? Like there are countries like Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, where you have to run independently. So if you don't have political parties, no nepotism, there's no further, leg up to it, and you have to run on your briefs and policies which can run differently. Do you think abolition of political parties could be a great idea? What do you think of that?
Thanks for that question. I don't think anyone on this panel speaks for the African Union. With the two questions that we have and the question from the audience, I will open it up to folks. The question on transition: how can we work with African leaders towards ensuring that they see the benefits in leaving power when their time is up? And then also, what are some of the economic or political indicators that we see in countries that at least gives us a heads up to know that a coup might happen, and how can we work to prevent it? And what role does technology play in enhancing democratic processes and reducing the likelihood of coups in Africa? Who would like to start? Jide, go ahead.
So thank you for the questions. I think there is and it's important to stress this point, there is a correlation, not a causation, between economic indicators and coup risk. It's really important to stress. And as I started my presentation, I talked about compounded variables that could collectively contribute to coup triggers. Again, that's an important point to stress. So because if you look at the indicators, yes, it is true. And from our research, we saw that, most of the countries that we were able to survey in terms of the data we gathered and looking at just simple secondary data sources, we saw that most of the countries ranked quite low when it comes to their human development indicators in comparison with other African countries, not even in comparison with countries outside of Africa, right? But there are some outliers. So if you look at countries like Gabon, right? If you look at, to some extent, Niger, you would really see that, countries have been growing in their economic performance over the last decade. So it's important that when we think about the, economic vulnerabilities associated with coup risk, it is combined with other variables as well. I think that's really an important point to mention. I think the point you made around technology, I think one aspect that we've been thinking about within the context of the AFSIT is how can we use compounded data to be anticipatory in nature, So how do we benefit from, data from social media? How do we benefit from existing secondary sources data to begin to think about triangulating and utilizing this data for anticipatory analysis that can facilitate prevention? And we are welcoming ideas here because this is one aspect in terms of recommendations that came out of our research. And we are going to be, calling on think tanks to help us develop a methodology that can help us do this. And so AFSIT would contribute to that knowledge base that subsequently can help in our advocacy towards prevention. Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, would you like?
Yeah, thanks. With regards to indicators, the single biggest predictor of coups that I'm aware of is previous coups in that country and having passed military government as well as coups in the region. So there's a contagion effect. That's why it's important that there's a strong response to coups and they're not enabled and recognized and validated. In terms of preventing, I think it's important to invest in and strengthen democracies so that they have more resiliency. And that's across a range of institutions, governance, economic, and security, which of course is a key dynamic of what happened in the Sahel. And I think, the other element of that, and I have to continue to bring it in, but it's an external factor where you have Russian disinformation pouring into West Africa and across Africa right now. But there was massive amounts of Russian disinformation prior to all three of the Sahelian coups, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And that's currently happening in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana. And so they're, part of preventing coups is helping citizens in these countries maintain control of their information space so that there's a genuine dialogue about what is happening and the threats that they're facing and how they want to tackle them. On the issue of leaders' unwillingness to step down, it's a perennial and fundamental challenge. And I think one of the geniuses of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation is that they have an award for leaders who step down. And so you have some incentives for that. I'd like to see there be more incentives. In the end, though, leaders are acting in self-interest rather than public interest. And we need to recognize that. It's why forging separation between political power and economic power is so important in a state building and democracy building process. But it in the end is going to require, putting pressure on the South Sudan situation where Salva Kiir intends to stay in power indefinitely, where that's the focus of his power is the patronage that he can effect. And calling that out and helping incentivize his departure, I think is the way we have to deal with this. But it's a real issue. There are a dozen African leaders that have been in power for more than 20 years. And we're seeing a recreation where the evasion of term limits is okay. Having fraudulent elections is accepted. And so we're seeing a return to these presidents for life. That was the norm in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. And so it is going to require us talking about what's going on and how do we regain a process where African citizen agency is re-enabled.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Khalid, I don't know if you want to add to that, but we have two more questions from online. I can take those questions and then you can add a response on, because I want to make sure we get to these questions because these are really good questions. So regarding the African Political Risk Index, risk transition index that was mentioned as a way to identify and prevent risk, what quantifiable aspects of society or government should we measure to allow for appropriate insight? So is there any, are there any, is there quantifiable data that we can use to measure? And then this is a follow-on question to Joe. And this person clearly asks, do sanctions work? Do sanctions still work? Considering the gap that the US and the West leaves in some of these countries, it's usually filled by other actors. Do sanctions work? So before we go to those two questions, Khalid, if you want to add on to the other questions, add a response. I also ask the panel to please keep your responses brief as well.
Sure, thank you, Oge. Just because, you know, you just asked those questions, not to preempt anything that Joe's going to say, but to my mind, do sanctions work is a question, it depends. Is there a strategy within which these sanctions work? If there isn't, then no. If there is, then maybe. But sanctions serve multiple functions. They serve legal functions, they serve financial functions, and they serve symbolic functions. And sometimes sanctioning actors can create the leverage you need to be able to engage with them. What we have seen from the US is actually quite a timid sanctions-averse policy on Africa, which oftentimes means that you're not able to bring some of these actors to the table because why would they come? You have nothing over them. So I would just briefly say that about the sanctions. To the question about should the African Union ban political parties? I mean, I don't think the African Union is in a position to do anything, let alone ban political parties. But what I would say is when you look at countries that don't have political parties, like the ones that you mentioned in the Gulf, I wouldn't say that they are anywhere near the kind of level of freedom that even they want. But there is a social contract that exists there that maybe suits some of them for the meantime. One country that is struggling with this is Saudi Arabia, because its population has ballooned over the past decade or so. It has severe challenges in keeping its quite diverse population happy with the status quo. There are questions around the succession of King Salman and to what extent that can be entrenched before he passes, if he hasn't already. And all of these questions cause a lot of problems for the regime. So it may look rosy on the outside and very, very sort of straightforward, but it's anything but that. And just to cast a question about South Sudan, Kiir and Machar have had their run-ins for decades now. And at some point, there will be incentives for both of them to make nice. They're not the people I'm worried about. What I'm worried about is the people behind them. Those who may not be part of, you know, may not see any gain from such a relationship, and those at the community level, more so. As you know, in South Sudan, it's community violence above all that is concerning. And with the prospect of an election this year, unless there are safeguards put in, that is, I think, where we should be looking, not between Machar and Kiir. But the question then becomes, you know, to your point about the social contract, renewing, what is the social contract we want to renew? In South Sudan, this social contract is based on an armed struggle and a sort of victor's peace, if you will, that's anything but peaceful. And it's based mostly in relation to what is now a foreign country in Khartoum. Is there a social contract in South Sudan that is entirely to do with South Sudan? And I'd say the answer is no. And in some countries in the Sahel, you know, what is the social contract built there? Some kind of paternalism with France? You know, where is the local? Where is the community? Where is the domestic in that social contract? And oftentimes, the more it's fashioned in response to what is now or what has become a foreign power or a foreign entity, the less likely it is to hold, and the more it should be scrapped altogether rather than, for example, renewed. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much, Khalid. And I am being told that we are 5 minutes over, and I don't want them to yank us off. But as you see, this is a very, very interesting conversation, one that I hope we continue. So I'm going to go ahead and close us off here. You know, I was just telling the panelists before we came on stage that last night I just got back from Nigeria yesterday, and while I was in the country, ECOWAS had actually withdrawn the sanctions that it had placed on some of the coup-impacted countries in the region. Thus far, no response from those countries or acknowledgement of the actions that ECOWAS carried out. So obviously, this is a conversation that is ongoing. So as we think about the political transition process, the process that comes after a coup or the process that comes before a coup, these are the types of core conversations that we should be having here and hopefully coming out with recommendations to address some of these key questions. So I hope this conversation doesn't end here today. I hope that all those of you who have joined us in the room and those of you who have joined us online, that we continue these discussions in our different organizations or different circles where we find ourselves. And please, if you haven't, I encourage you to pick up the UNDP report on soldiers and citizens. I think a lot of what we discussed here today, a lot of those recommendations are outlined in the conversation. So Jide, thank you for joining us today. Joe, thank you as well for joining us. And Khalud, thank you as well for all your remarks. And I hope if you do have a few minutes to stay over, because I see that there are a lot of curious eyes in the audience and folks with a lot of questions, and I hope you'll be able to continue engaging with them. So please join me in thanking the audience.